My name is Patrik Rosander. I'm a senior concept artist. I worked in the games industry and entertainment industry as a whole for 12 years. And I started out working in small studios, and eventually I worked myself up to bigger AAA studios as a more of a specialist. I'm currently at Remedy Entertainment. And I've always been a big fan of vistas in games. You know, those moments where you just like take a moment and enjoy the view and get transported into another world. And creating those kind of moments have been a driving force in my concept art career, and then trying to get those moments into every single game that I work on. But there's very little information on how to create those vistas and those moments. So today I'm going to present my approach focused on matte painting. And there are many other techniques different from matte painting that you can use, and different workflows you can use to create large vistas, but this is like another tool that you can have in your toolbox. So what you see here is the result that we're going for. And the example that I'm going to be showing today is not connected to any Remedy projects, current or future. It's just made for this talk. So first I'm going to cover the background and the core concepts of a matte painting. And in my view, the different components you need to pay attention to is the camera placement, the geometry placement, and where the matte painting lives in the world. Then I'm going to go through a quick creation process where we create the example that I just showed you guys. So matte painting has a long history, from painting on glass back in the day to digital matte painting and slowly evolving into full 3D environments. And according to Wikipedia, a matte painting is a representation of a landscape, set, or a distant location that allows filmmakers to create an illusion of an environment that is not present at the filming location. For me, it's a way to show a larger world and to inform the player of like the bigger universe that they're a part of. And it's usually with way beyond the scope of a game production to create spectacles like that are actually playable. So I find that it's a technique that is as powerful in games as it is in movies. And just like in movies, matte paintings and vistas help you show the world outside of the game space. You might be walking on a very constricted street area, but a matte painting and a good vista gives you the feeling that you're in an epic hive city, for example, in this picture. It's also a very important part of creating a suspension of disbelief for the player, making sure that they buy into the entire story and the premise of the game. So the easiest way to describe a matte painting in a game is that it's a texture with baked-in lighting on a low-poly geometry with an unlit shader. And texture is actually the big limiting factor of a matte painting in games. You can push as much detail as you can possibly get into that texture, but the cost of a matte painting is generally extremely cheap and performant. And the actual virtue of this technique, that is a simple geometry and just a texture and unlit shader, makes the iteration time and the creation time extremely fast. So when it comes to creating our matte painting asset, there are a couple of elements to consider. The first is the camera. Second one is the placement of the matte painting and the projection geometry. I'll go through what these are in further detail. So a matte painting always looks best when it's viewed head-on. And the further the view angle strays from that head-on position, the more the illusion will start to break and you'll get distortion in the actual matte painting. And when it comes to placing the matte painting in a game, I always think of a game level as having 3 layers. You have the foreground geometry, you have the backdrop geometry, and the skybox. Where the foreground is the player interactable space, the backdrop is the jump towards the sky dome, but you can never interact with it. And the sky dome, of course, is just a texture. And you can basically place a matte painting as close to the player as you want. The projection geometry and the texture resolution will be the limiting factor. but it usually holds up really close. So this is a little formula I use. Just keep it in the back of your head if you're going to do a matte painting. So the distance to the camera and the view angle. For example, if you're going to view the matte painting from the start of the level and the end of the level, you have like a 90-degree change of angle of view. That kind of dictates the complexity of your geometry that you're going to create. So why use a matte painting in the first place? You could just paint the detail and the information in the sky dome or make a 3D model. I mean, every project is different and you kind of need to make your own judgment calls, but a sky dome most usually does not have the text resolution for a good, like, detailed backdrop, and it also lacks parallax, which we'll talk on later on. The 3D model approach is great, and I would actually recommend it, but it takes a lot of time, and it's really tough to iterate on. But if you have the project and the timeline that allows it, go ahead, do it. Yeah, let's get into the creation process. So for this example, I'm going to create a matte painting for a level segment in a first-person shooter, and it's a traversal area between two gameplay areas. And this is the prime location for a matte painting. Player has nothing to do except breathe out between like two very intense, hopefully, encounters, and they just kind of like get a palette cleanser and enjoy the view. And of course, it's a sci-fi universe because that's what I like doing. So this is a brief kind of outline. The steps I have here, you can skip some, you can move them around a bit with experience, but it's good to have as a starting point. So first up is selecting the camera location. So I have a fly-through of the level example that we're going to be working with. And as you can see, there are going to be a couple of instances where the camera looks kind of straight ahead into the void. That is an ideal camera hero view, I like to call it. Basically the reference point of our matte painting. And basically, when you're going to select the camera view, you want to have it in the middle point of the level. For example, you see there's maybe a 50-meter segment that we're going to be walking through. So we want to have it in a place that represents the best picture of those 50 meters of traversal. So here we see the critical path, or the player path, in a more overhead view, with the dots representing the potential camera locations. We have a start, a middle, and a ending camera location. And they also have kind of a difference in verticality. You start a level maybe 20 meters higher than you actually end the level. And we need to select the midpoint for the vertical position as well, because the perspective will be decided by the actual hero location that we choose. If the location is too low, the perspective will look wrong in the beginning. If it's too high, it will look wrong in the end. So this, the one in the middle, is the selected hero location. Look straight out into the void, like the matte painting territory, and it's in the vertical middle of the level and the kind of horizontal middle as well. So the next step is blocking it out. I use Unreal in this example, and using their brushes and 3D models, I quickly kind of make a block out of the composition that I want to have. And it's really important to work on it through the entire level segment, watching it from every single view, and paying attention to both the scale cues and the kind of the parallax you get and the distance and scale you get from the small objects next to the big ones. Because in the end, if it doesn't look good in this state, there's no way to save it. And in this example as well, we have a lighting setup, which provides us with some nice specularity and some nice shadows. And for a matte painting, it is kind of a must to have some sort of basic lighting setup in the beginning, because you will position your objects and your matte painting elements in order to catch that light, to get the specularity to really communicate the materials of the objects that you have. It's the main key ingredient of doing a good matte painting. So the more work you get done in this stage, the better. And as I said before, this is like the defining point. It might not look like much, it's just a couple of boxes, but to me it's the most important point. Because if it doesn't work here, it will never work. So the next step is creating the concept art. You might already have a concept before starting. I'm a concept artist. I usually work on my own concepts for the matte paintings. Every studio is different. But my process is to export the foreground geometry of the level, export the camera as well, and the block out. That way I have a one-to-one representation of the level, but in my 3D package. And I can confidently go forward and just flash the matte painting out without any kind of hesitation if it will work in game or not. If it works here, it will work in game. And don't be afraid to kind of go back, switch up the camera angles, and experiment, because we only spent like half a day, maybe at this point, with a finished concept, maybe 1 day, 2 days. And the power of this technique is that it's so straightforward that you can just restart it, and restart it until you really get the good composition that sells the fantasy you're going for. But the downside of being a concept artist is you want to make a kick-ass concept, and this is not the time to create a kick-ass concept necessarily. It's a step in the process. This is just a sketch in order for us to get information of what elements we want in the actual matte painting. For example, how does the sky intersect with the space elevator that I made here? How does the God rays look? How does the fog interact? I think I put some red position lights, which are always a favorite thing of mine to put. And all those elements need to be represented in the matte painting using additional geometry or shaders. So even this concept for me is a way to plan out my coming workflow. So once this is done, we're going to set up the projection. And basically, we're using the concept art camera, we're zooming it out to give us more screen real estate. As you can see, there's kind of space for the mountains and space for the sky as well, because this is more like the player is going to see in game. And the concept is always zoomed in to look awesome and sell stuff, but this is the practical camera. We have enough geometry and kind of space in the foreground to create the transition as well once we get to that stage. So in most cases, as I said before, you're going to need to reposition your camera and tweak it until you actually get a good matte painting render out of your 3D scene. And once you've done that, you're going to go ahead and basically duplicate the scene and delete all your beautiful geometry and add a plane instead. And you can just map your plane to that, map your texture to that plane using a UV projection from the camera. And then you should have basically the same result as your heavy 3D scene, but just on a flat plane. And this is basically the setup that goes into the engine. And as you can see here, we have, basically the matte painting concept, but just on a plane projected in the game world. Yeah. And the good part about it is the fact that even if it's just a plane, you get immense amount of detail. And that's the power of this technique. So thank you for coming to my talk. And have a good afternoon. No, just kidding. No. So that's the point. If it doesn't look good right now, it never will, right? It's everything after this stage is just creating more detail in the matte painting, fleshing it out, and having fun with it. But this is the main iteration cycle, right? You select your camera position, you place the matte painting in the world, and you create your projection geometry. And it's never going to get better, no matter how much painting time or rendering time you put into it. So this is the next step in the process. We have fleshed out the train and the actual 3D geometry of the main building. And as you can see, the difference is not huge, but the detail is starting to get in there. And the sky dome is there as well. It's just a 16-bit HDRI. but it's an important part to try to build up towards the concept that we did earlier. And keeping the models at around 80% finished is kind of a core concept here. You don't want to push it too far because you still want to be able to go back and change things. And there's a couple of more steps we're going to add on before we can pull the trigger and just go to town and paint. So we also want to refine our plane or our projection geometry in order to get the most out of it in engine. So just by adding depth into the projection geometry, we can create parallax and we can make the matte painting stand up much more to different view angles than just a flat plane. And as you can see, we have the mountains moving in the back in relation to the sci-fi structure. And that kind of illusion really helps set the tone of the matte painting and helps it integrate into the game world. It's really easy to overdo it, and but that kind of breaks the illusion as well. So don't have too much fun with the parallax. And the next step when kind of the parallax works is to add dynamic elements. So for me, I want to have the matte painting working in a static shot. Here I've added some simple sky animation using flow maps. And to kind of integrate that into the painting, I also added cloud shadows, which is basically a noise texture that we just tile all over the matte painting, kind of match the speeds. And it already makes it feel like it's a kind of a part of the game lighting and game world instead of just a painting. And as a cherry on top, I'm putting in my favorite signal lights as well. Here they come. Nice. Which is basically just an additive plane that we make visible and hide with a looping script. And just by adding these elements, you have something that looks like it could just be a 3D model, right, in a game. There's no real difference from the player's point of view, but it's just a very cheap asset and quick asset to make. So at this point, we have our projection geometry set up. We have our refined shapes. We have our dynamic elements. We know that this is going to work, right? We can actually start enjoying the work process. So for this stage, what I've done here is I basically just improved on the train geometry, improved on the sci-fi asset geometry, improved on the sky dome, and the dynamic elements as well, making sure that the speeds of the animation is correct, and also adding cloud planes and mist cloud cards to help the painting sit better into the actual environment. And the key part of this part is actually to hide all the seams and make sure that it seamlessly integrates with the backdrop geometry. In this case, I put the seams in the shadow areas, which is a cheap trick, but if you can't do that, just make sure that the edges are high poly and that it intersects with the geometry in a nice way. And there's always other tricks you can use. Tree cards, etc., alpha blending. So basically, this is the target that you want to reach. You have a really detailed background that is basically almost a one-man show. It takes usually between 1 to 2 weeks to make, or even shorter if the brief is simpler. And I mean, when we're at that stage with the refined 3D, we can just start painting. And I think that's the beauty, at least for me as a concept artist, of this technique is we have the texture set up, so I can use whatever tool that I want. Photos, photo bashing, just pushing the 3D more just to create the most kind of epic painting I could possibly create. But the actual limiting factor is, as I said before, the texture memory. Yeah, and also a good point to think about is if you push the detail too much, you will eventually kind of overdo it. Like you will have a matte painting that is more detailed than the game world, and that kind of like ruins their entire thing. You need to restrain yourself and remember that you're working on a game that needs to like look cohesive. So what about performance, right? It's always a big question in games. And like I said before, this is an unlit asset. It's low poly, but it still has kind of a performance footprint, even if it's really lightweight. And of course, the heaviest element is the texture size, but it's also very scalable and it's a known quantity up front. you know what you're going to aim for, and it's going to be constant once you actually pay that cost. And the geometry should be super light. You can go from a couple of hundred triangles to like a couple of thousand, depending on the complexity of your projection, etc. And the shader setup, as I said, is extremely simple. Alpha overdraw, like in this case, can be a factor, but you can also just cut off the geometry using the alpha channel and just remove all the alpha straight away. So in my mind, this technique is really fast and efficient. That's why I'm promoting it today. And it's a good way to create awe-inspiring moments in games and just helps you players get into that fantasy and enjoy the world. And yeah, that's my approach to creating matte paintings in games. And thank you guys for coming. Also, a shout out to Justin for mentoring the talk, and Johan Barek back at home. He's my shader guy who helped me with this workflow. And Remedy's hiring. Go in and check it out. Looking for a lot of positions from all over the world. And that's my socials if you want to get in touch or have any questions. Okay, any questions? No? Well, then I wish you a great afternoon and a good flight home. Oh, we have one, no? No? Yeah, cool.
I just wanted to ask you how much support you have from the 3D artists to create that structure. Do you do it all yourself, or do you have it?
I usually do it myself, but I'm a very 3D heavy concept artist nowadays. But I mean, if we are in production and we actually have a asset library, then the work is already done, right? So I'll just kit bash away. Yeah.
So the actual design of that structure is yours as well? Like
Yeah.
one? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Cool. Thanks.
Thank you.
Maybe one more question. So,
Of course.
when you show the parallax effect, that you just split up the plane as manual work into more vertices and then extrude it, or is that an automatic process?
No, since the geometry is so low poly, I just do it manually. And the UVs are projected from the camera, so there's no work when it comes to remapping the UVs or anything. It's just moving vertices into space. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
How much do you rely on, like what's your split between 2D and 3D? Like how much are you doing hand painting versus the 3D rendering?
Nowadays, I do like 70 to 90% 3D. But it all depends on the actual brief. For example, train, mountains and stuff. In this case, I almost always photos because it's not worth the time investment for me as a concept artist to do the high-end train stuff. Not yet, but
Thank you.
no worries. Okay, well, thank you all, and have a good afternoon.